Good evening to all of you. Sir tóibín, you're kind of the delicatesse of this literary year. You're the prelude and the appetizer of, and the highlight already, before the year has even started. How does that feel?
Appetizer is good.
You will be reading in a moment. But before that, let me just briefly say a few words about you. Things you probably know. Most of you probably do too. I've been thinking, a novel based on Greek mythology requires an epitheton ornans for the author, who is so daring. And I thought, colm tóibín, writer of words, sentences, scenes and stories, creator of characters, miner of souls, scavenger of truth, perhaps, master of silence, or of reading between the lines. And on a more less literary note, melomanic swimmer, or brother of others, son of two, private activist or active privateer, if such a word exists, and so on and so on. I mean, I'm not a Greek poet, let that be clear, but tonight's guest is an author who has acquired a name beyond epitheton ornans of his own, writing stories about leaving and returning, exile and return, loss and longing, family ties, family burden also. He wrote on his literary heroes, he fictionalized some of their lives, he explored and explained some of their works. I'm thinking of Henry James, Elizabeth Bishop, amongst others. And he stands in their shoes, like Mother Mary, for example, or in this case, House of Names, in the shoes of some of the greatest female Greek mythological characters. We'll be talking about that, but let me invite you to give us a taste of the book. If you like, please, at a lectern.
This is the very opening of the book, and it's Clytemnestra. She's really rather pleased with herself because she has just murdered her husband. She planned it meticulously. I think we know the story that when the Trojan War was to begin, that the winds would not change, and they appealed to the gods, and the gods said, yes, but you must sacrifice your daughter Iphigenia. And so Agamemnon, the king, sent for his wife and his daughter, fooling them into coming, telling them that I have a husband for our beautiful daughter, Achilles the warrior. And his wife arrived, and he didn't even have the courage to tell her. And it looked like a moment of pure happiness with her son, and they were all reunited. And then she found out. And what she did everything to prevent it, and she failed. And when she failed, she decided that if he came home victorious from the war, that she would in turn murder him, as he, as far as she was concerned, had murdered their daughter. He doesn't just come home victorious from the war, he comes home victorious and loquacious, and he can't stop boasting about all the things he did. She's watching him. She knows what she's going to do. He's also brought Cassandra with him, a slave who's very beautiful, and she throws her into the equation. He's rather pleased about that too. So this is her opening remarks. Remarks is a good way of putting it. Describing how she feels and what's happening in the immediate aftermath of what she's done. I have been acquainted with the smell of death, the sickly, sugary smell that wafted in the wind towards the rooms in this palace. It is easy for me to feel peaceful and content. I spend my morning looking at the sky and the changing light. The bird song begins to rise as the world fills with its own pleasures. And then as day wanes, the sound too wanes and fades. I watch as shadows lengthen. So much has slipped away, but the smell of death earth lingers. Maybe the smell has entered my body and been welcomed there, like an old friend come to visit. Smell of fear, panic. Smell is here like the very air is here. It returns in the same way as light in the morning returns. It is my constant companion. It has put life into my eyes, eyes that grew dull with waiting, but are not dull now. Eyes that are alive now, with brightness. I gave orders that the body should remain in the open under the sun a day or two, until the sweetness gave way to stench. And I liked the flies that came, their little bodies perplexed and brave, buzzing after their feast, upset by the continuing hunger. They felt in themselves a hunger I had come to know too, had come to appreciate. We're all hungry now. Food merely whets our appetite, it sharpens our teeth. Meat makes us ravenous for more meat, as death is ravenous for more death. Murder makes us ravenous, fills the soul with satisfaction that is fierce and then luscious enough to create a taste for further satisfaction. A knife piercing the soft flesh under the ear with intimacy and precision, and then moving across the throat as soundlessly as the sun moves across the sky, but with greater speed and zeal, and then his dark blood flowing with the same inevitable hush as dark night falls on familiar things.
You make murder you make it sound poetic. The sounds, the pleasure she feels or remembering it. Is this a story you always knew? You were told young?
I knew the Electra part of the story. You know, in other words, I knew that there was a daughter, and that in the aftermath of this killing, Electra blames her mother, not her father, and wants to have revenge on her mother. And those versions of the Electra story I knew, but I didn't know this, which is a late play by Euripides called Iphigenia in Aulis, which is really, it looks as though in old age Euripides realized what a bad press Clytemnestra had been given, and that actually there was an opening here for an artist to come and say, what if we told it from her side, rather than the angry daughter with all her savagery and all her rage outside the palace ready. What if we saw what caused all this in the first place? And we went back to the beginning. And it's a marvelous play, and I hadn't read it. And when I read it, the minute I read it, I thought, I could do that, you know, in sentences where, the aim is, I suppose, to give you something like that where you can say that, and by the end of the book say, that was very wrong of me to have. In other words, that by the end of the book, I think my job is to let you know that that initial delight has become the darkest thing, and has spiraled out of control, and that there are moments where we have real sympathy with her. We see exactly why she does what she does. And then other things begin to take over that we suddenly feel almost. So the drama is almost between our feeling that what she does is right, and then our feeling that we should not have felt that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you say when you read Euripides' version, you thought, I can do this in sentences, in prose. Wherein lies the pleasure of doing that? Or why did it need to be told in prose?
Well, there's no need for anything, you know.
Why did you feel it?
What happens really is that a memory, it could be a memory, or it could be an idea, or it could be something someone told you, or something someone you read, or something you read, lodges in the mind and just stays solid there. And then one day it becomes fluid. It moves into melody. It becomes rhythm. And you don't know why this has happened to one thing and not another. in a given season or in a given year. I was in New York and I was teaching a bit, but the rest of the time I was doing nothing much. But I wasn't sleeping really well. I blamed the central heating in America sometimes for everything, really, because they keep it on at night, which is, I mean, they're really, I think that's what drives them into the state they're in at the moment, is that they keep their central heating on at night. For any nation would go mad under those pressures. And but anyway, I was getting up quite early, 3:30, 4 in the morning, and what do you do that time of the morning? You drink tea, and but eventually started just those what I've just read to you now, just coming. Oh my God, here we go again, and not quite knowing where it was going to lead, even, but just starting like that with the actual sentences one by one, until I would find myself wanting to get back home every day to look over it, read over it, change a few words, add to it. It became interesting for me and exciting to see if I could get more of it down.
Clytemnestra is a very modern woman in a way, in the sense that she is one of the only ones who feels no need anymore for the gods. She says, I don't believe in them anymore, and she's wondering at one point whether Agamemnon really believes in them or sort of uses them as an excuse. Was this on the back of your mind? In the back of your mind, she needs to be a modern woman, because this is very contrary, of course, to the role of the gods in the original myths.
Yeah, it's a technical problem as to if you're writing. I mean, the novel as we know it depends on agency. It's filled with people who have chances and choices, who confront their destiny with some control over it. And, that it's unimaginable for us, for example, that the gods would come down in the middle of a Jane Austen novel and suddenly tell Mr. Darcy to get on his horse, and another god would provide the horse. Or that Lady Catherine de Bourgh would have invoked the fury of the gods, which is why she doesn't prevail in the novel. We just feel, no, even though they're clergymen, Mr. Collins, for example, in Pride and Prejudice, but we don't ever see him praying. We see him being a complete nuisance. And it is as though the form itself depends on human agency. And while people may go to church on Sunday, it mustn't get into the book very much. Now, I know novelists like Graham Greene tried to deal with this, but most novelists didn't. And so the problem is technical, that there are so many Greek gods, and their names are either too long or too short. And if you have them page after page, oh, she went into the room, and instead of plotting meticulously, she prayed once more. So, oh, stop it. In other words, it just wasn't going to work. It just wasn't going to have any impact. It was going to mean nothing much to me. But that's only the first reason. I think the second one is also that this book slowly, what happens with the book is that it begins to take on a shape that you didn't expect it to take, which is the shape of you. And you don't know what shape you are. And so, in other words, there's a huge amount of material about, say, contemporary Ireland in this book, and the last 30, 40, 50 years in Ireland. Just things I've been noticing, things that are on my mind, and also things that are happening, that you read about in the newspapers and see on television, make their way into the book without me meaning it, without me starting to say, I want to find a myth that will deliver the sort of emotion surrounding that. But one of the things that just in a few pages after what I've read, there's a moment where she remembers that in the time before death in her world, there would be a sign. People would get a sign. But where I'm from in the southeast of Ireland, people believed that. It was a pre-Christian thing, that the banshee or some figure would come and knock on a door. There'd be some cry in the night. But I'm talking about people believing this into the 60s. Now, it's too glib to say it didn't survive television, but it didn't survive. Within my families, people stopped believing it, who had believed it a decade earlier. And I didn't even notice that until I did. And then I thought, what a strange thing that animist belief or pagan belief could disappear, fade, and maybe even come up in some other way. So I was sort of trying to work out an idea of a society that had, which Ireland has done, which is secularized to a large extent over a period of 20 or 30 years, with other beliefs maybe that are there too. So, but I didn't mean to do this when I was starting. Just slowly it got in, because I think what you end up doing is putting what you know into the book. And sometimes you don't know what you know, and then it gets into the book.
You mentioned there is things that are on my mind about things going on in Ireland. You gave an example, but also politically, this cycle of violence. Has that echoes in Irish history that you found out writing the novel, or that were inspiring you while writing the novel somehow? I wrote about it in The Guardian.
Yeah, I think there's a shape to Irish history in the 20th century that's different to most European countries, with the exception maybe of Spain and perhaps Portugal. But that, and perhaps Greece, it's interesting about the four countries. We all got demonized recently for, not having enough money or something, or not. What did we do? We borrowed money or something. Whatever we did seemed normal to us at the time anyway, and not so normal to others. And, but that in Ireland, we effectively had two civil wars in the 20th century. And that when I wrote a book about the troubles in Northern Ireland, which I would call one of the civil wars, and what you learned was that an act of violence was often done in retaliation. And then you discover almost always was done in retaliation for something else. And something would occur after that. And that you just watched as the spiral began. There was something that it was very difficult to contain. It went on for a very long time because it couldn't be contained. It wasn't. It didn't have the great dramas which were still, for example, Dunkirk. The Second World War is still holding the imagination in an epic sort of way. This is a much more intimate story. And there was one particular episode. I don't know if you want me to talk about that, but
yes, please.
But in Seamus Heaney's Nobel address, he talked about the most harrowing event in a time of the harrowing of the heart in Northern Ireland. I think they're his words, which is called the Kingsville Massacre of 1976, where 12 men are coming home from work. It's the winter. It's January 76, and they're stopped by a paramilitary group. They don't know which side. And 11 of the men happen to be Protestants. One is a Catholic. They're all friends. They work together. And the people, the men with the guns say the one Catholic must stand aside. And they presume he's going to be shot. But when he stands aside eventually, they tell him to run. And they turn the guns on the 11. And they manage to kill 10 of them, one of whom survives. So when I was writing the book, in this town in Northern Ireland, were living the man who ran and the man who survived. And I went to see both of them. And the man who ran was so traumatized he just couldn't talk. And I knew he couldn't talk. And he just came to the door and we just had a few words. And eventually I said to him, did you think they were going to kill you? And he said to me, well, what would you have thought? And then he sort of closed the door, but gently, slowly. It wasn't aggressive. The other man said, I don't want to talk about it, but there's a TV documentary about it. And you can watch that in my house. But he had never watched the documentary. And he started to watch it as well. We both watched it. And it was the most difficult thing, because he had appeared in the documentary. And it really stayed in my mind, that idea that when I researched it further, that event was, claimed was in retaliation for something else. A week later, other things were done in turn that were in retaliation for that. So it was on my mind, that idea of intimate violence and neighbour against neighbour, or people living close to each other. And so some of that made its way into the book, but not. I didn't set a scene directly, or I think really, but much more just the idea that people who 10 years earlier were living ordinary lives as small farmers were 10 years later capable of something like this, and the following month went back to being, husbands, fathers. A lot of them went back into civilian life of people who committed to things like this in Northern Ireland very quickly. I mean, we got the leaders, but a lot of the ordinary people probably, there was no. I mean, in the case of the event I've just described, we don't know the names. They've never been charged of who did it. We presume they're still alive. We presume they're living locally. Some people know their names, but they're living locally. And my dream, my imagination is they're living locally quite normally, that they are probably really good fathers, they're probably really good husbands, they're probably nice people. And just that turn, that thing is there, and it's something we have to be alert to. And it's something that you can dramatize.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, here within the setting of a family, very intimate, really. Clytemnestra at one point thinks about Electra. After Clytemnestra kills Agamemnon, she turns into herself, and she cannot really bear to talk to Electra about it. And she later on muses that maybe she should have, because Electra then turns away from her mother, is angry at her mother, like you said. So there's this is a very mother-daughter-like element in the book. It's very recognizable, I think, for a young woman in 2017 or a mother in 2017 thinking like, oh no, I didn't handle this very well with my daughter, and now how do I right this wrong? I cannot. And here it's crucial because it sets in motion, or this is what Clytemnestra thinks, this motion of violence, because Electra harbors this anger and hatred towards her mother. So how then did you give Electra a voice that is different from what went on before, this angry young woman? Because she's more than that in this book, I feel.
I have to be careful with that, because I've given Clytemnestra such an amount of strength that I have to bring the daughter down a notch from where she is in some of the theatrical versions, say the Sophocles version, and where at the beginning of my version, she's someone who just lives with ghosts. She lives with her father's ghost and her sister's ghost. She's not in that rage. And then slowly she moves into that rage. And that rage, depends on the fact that when her mother was so traumatized by the fact that she had taken her daughter to a wedding and her daughter had been instead sacrificed, that when she came home, she simply could not do anything other than plan revenge, and almost didn't notice that this other daughter was sort of flitting about, was suffering greatly, and that so that the daughter and the mother begin this immense conflict, but that slowly the daughter is becoming the mother. And it's the brother who notices that by the end of the book that his sister is actually behaving like his mother. And so I just, trying to work out that slowly and psychologically, so that it might convince some reader that this happened, and that these months where she didn't manage to share with her daughter or keep her daughter on side, she lost her completely and could never get her back.
Was the psychology of the characters more important to you than the Greek mythological setting? Because that's really in the background, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because if you're working with a novel, you can't work with the chorus. You can't work with the grand emotions you can get from having a chorus or having using myth. You have to bring the myth down almost into the domestic. You have to allow people to have motives, to work out their motives slowly. And therefore, it's such a different form. It's such a modern form that you really can't work. It can be animated by myth, but it can't, in fact, myth cannot dictate the pace or the tone or the texture of what you're doing, that must be done by a sense of the ordinary, a sense of the daily, a sense of the much more easy and familiar than the grand business of Oedipus complex, Electra complex. You just bring them down. I don't know how you'd bring the Oedipus down, but it can be done. If you did have a character who, what did he do? He married his own mother. Yeah. If someone wanted to have a go at that, it'd be interesting to see.
Did you ever think at one point, I'd better make a play out of it? At least I can go all the way, or use the antique Greek antics to put it on stage? I thought it even was going to be a play originally, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the opening monologue, which is about 70 pages, if I shortened it, which I haven't done, probably could hold it, could be done in that way, in the sense I'd written the Testament of Mary, which is for an actress. But really, once I started it, I realized I want to get bring the other characters in and see how this goes. I mean, the play part began to matter as well, because I began to use Hamlet as much as I was using, and then realizing, of course, how much Shakespeare had stolen from the Oresteia. In other words, here you have the young man, as in Erastes, puzzled, uneasy, wandering the palace. His father is dead, has been murdered. His mother has remarried, and everything's uncertain. And it's such an obvious thing. I'd never thought of it before. But once I thought of it, I realized I needed to go back to Hamlet and start looking at the ways in which Shakespeare had humanized the myth, or softened it, or given it a sort of psychological purity, and let the ghost in. Had done both.
Quite a challenge. Erastes is at the center of the book. You could say he grows up throughout the novel, but he's not speaking for himself.
Yeah, he doesn't really grow up. In other words, his sister and his mother are filled with strategy, and he's the one who just doesn't have that nerve. He doesn't have that chromosome, that he just isn't ever able to work out what's going on. He's not a psychopath. He's just the younger brother. He often misses the point of things. He's sad rather than tragic. And in the way
how do you make readers love a character like that, or care for him?
You give him a bad time quite early on in the book. You have him kidnapped, and someone said, I'm really not making this up, but someone who read the book just when it came out, who was in the same Irish Catholic diocesan boarding school as I was in, said, I see you finally put us into your novel. Because I brought him to an Irish diocesan Catholic boarding school, circa 1970. And the reader, I think, feels sorry for anyone who was ever put in that situation. And I remember how sorry my family felt for me once they put me there. They wouldn't let me out or anything, but they did feel really sorry for me. And so I was sort of giving a lot of that sort of business to poor old Erastes. I'm trying to build him up, because he will eventually murder his mother. And I want him not to be a psychopath, but I want him to be someone who's capable of anything. That no moral questions interest him one way or the other. If the pressure is on, he'll do one thing. If another pressure is on, he'll do another. He'll usually just be quiet, missing the point, coming into the room, wondering if there's food. And his sister does all the doing and thinking. And any of us, I'm fourth in a family, so I really know this. If you come fourth or even second in a family, it really does matter. If I was a psychiatrist, it's the first question I'd ask you: where do you come in a family? And we'd be better just to have only children, because the second one really does have to suffer from being the shadow, the sense of, all the negotiations were done before I came. I'm just the spare.
Poor Orestes, indeed. But he doesn't grow up. He grows older. Let me correct myself then.
Oh, right, yeah.
And he spends not only time in this horrible place, but also with a couple of friends in a house, the house in the title, one of the houses in the title perhaps, with an old lady and two of his friends and dogs somewhere on the outskirts. It's almost like paradise, or very, not literally paradise, but arcadic, is that a word in English?
Yeah.
Finding out nothing, really.
Finding out nothing. I mean, I think in a novel, one of the things you have to do is, if you have someone who's very bad, give them elements that are good, vary the characters, vary the tones, but also, if you're going to have a lot of violence, and I hadn't really done this before, have a big moment where there's no violence, where there is ease, where you can look back years later thinking, there was ease in this place. We entered into this, almost into this Valhalla, or perhaps more even Shangri-La, you know, the sort of lost horizon, into a world where time didn't seem to matter. And some of it's quite close to Irish myth as well, where one of the stories told is the story of Helen of Troy. But one of the other stories told is this Irish story of the children of Lir, which also has swans in it. And so I threw in the Irish story just to take this episode of his life out of time, as though it didn't happen in time, as though it was dream time, the time when he was away, the time no one wants to know about, and allow all that to have its own flavor or sound that's different from the rest of the book.
You mentioned earlier in the conversation there are things that you read about in the newspaper that were also around when you were writing this novel. And then, of course, I couldn't help thinking about young men going out, killing in the name of a god or of God, for ISIS, for example. Is that something that was on your mind as well, or that you echoed somehow?
Yeah, that if you look closely at some of the examples, some of the recent examples, you often find there's a younger brother involved. That's just, if you look at the names, you find two brothers. And it was that relationship. I mean, let's just take one example, case of the Boston Marathon bomb.
It's on knives.
Yes, and there were 7 years between them. Because the older brother was killed, we just got the younger brother's, his silence, but we also got from the imagery in the courtroom his coldness. The fact that he had stood there knowing that people around him were going to be killed, and then gone and had a drink with his friends. I wonder, how did that conversation begin? It began between two brothers. It began within a family, you know, and the dynamic there between the two of them. So I was certainly interested in that, in the creation of Erastes in this book. Yeah.
Just on the side, does it help you understand this psychology, or what happens in a young man's mind, or between brothers?
I'm not sure I'm interested in that as much as that I'm creating drama. And so that drama is then open to us to you know, that conflict between the love between two brothers becoming a sort of control and making its way into a violence, are a set of images that fascinate me and that I can work with. Now, as to whether that means that I then understand that, I mean, that's a different sort of question in a way.
That's not what you said.
I mean,
it
arose.
obviously.
I mean, it arose recently where, you know, I've lived a lot in Barcelona, and that what happened in Barcelona, you know, it was so shocking because a year earlier it was not going to happen, and you know, everyone can pinpoint the arrival of a figure who will influence a number of young men at a particular time in their teenage years. But if he hadn't arrived, it wouldn't have happened. So I think it's important for us to remember, it's not as though this is always going to happen. That you know, just it's almost like something happening in chemistry. And so I'm trying to work my way through that in the book, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So there is this point where Electra and Orestes have this conversation, like the Tsarnaev brothers probably have had, about killing their mother. And then, I'm not betraying anything, am I?
No, we all know the story, I think.
Yeah, she is killed. And then I was struck by the fact that Electra, the very practical one, is going back to business as usual and running the country, or trying to. And there is a lot in the book also about power, and more specifically the lure of power. There are phrases where Orestes notices how people are in awe or want to be in the orb of power, both with his mother when she was still alive, and later he sees that with Electra and Leander as well. Is that something you notice through writing, or is power something magical to you as well?
Well, you see, this is also something that's happened in Ireland, where we have there are two parliaments on the island now. And the parliaments deal every day with the smallest questions to do with water charges or, taxation. And we notice in both cases that the parties that were involved in the violence in Ireland tend to have just ordinary opinions about ordinary matters to do with water. And you watch them thinking, the last time I heard it from you, I know what you were doing. And look at you now. And you think, well, that's called progress. I mean, that's what we're all hoping for, but that's also built into the DNA, and that's also built into the system that Electra will plan this. But it isn't the story of it isn't her story. Her story is that she also wants to have minute power over, how things will be managed. There's another thing she must manage. She becomes a manager.
Yeah, it's about very mundane things indeed, like what to plant and when to harvest and how to organize it and get everybody involved.
I think in any, I think in somewhere like Colombia at the moment, I mean, FARC are desperately involved in, can you send us more cabbage seeds so we can plant them? And that 5 years ago, FARC were doing something else. And not that I think they have that much cabbage in Colombia, but you know what I mean.
Could be something else, indeed. But the crux is, the lesson passed on about power is that is how we keep power, by not trusting. So the seeds for another tragedy and more bloodshed and other people trying to take over power is already there. The cycle continues.
I think this is why this story that is thousands of years old continues to haunt us, because here we see it. It began with the most flimsy business over Helen of Troy, and then the Trojan War, and then the sacrificing of the daughter, and then there's revenge for that, and then the revenge in turn for that, and the sort of mixture of intimate revenges with this large war that didn't seem likely a year before. And so we're still, in a way, we're still living in the aftermath of these Greek. I mean, it isn't as though anything significant has changed. It isn't as though if one of the Greeks now went into the United Nations today and just sat there watching speeches and looking around thinking, I don't think we could put on these plays. Again, the answer is yes, we do. We do put them on. We make new versions of them. They're constant new productions. The number of, say, recent productions of the Aristeia is just huge. Actors love working with him because those emotions and that way that the drama is being worked out both intimately and publicly, it still is something we're living with.
I've read quite a couple of reviews. Candom. Do you read reviews of your own books?
If they're really good, if I'm declared an international genius, and if I'm compared to you know, John Banville or someone, I'll let Banville know by the end of the day.
Okay. I'm asking because the reading of the ending is quite different sometimes, and people read very different things in it. Are you pleased with that?
I suppose. I mean, I'm interested in the fact that I added on, you know, quite a lot. I mean, I think one of the things you can do with these stories is you can see what you can do with them. There's no reason to be faithful to the original. People can get the original any time, but that whole idea of making the spiral go further, seeing them in power, and then the whole idea of it ending at the very end with some possibility of a way out of this being open. I mean, not fully open, but just a door opening to
if you're willing to see the door.
Yeah, if you're willing to see the door, that even though so much killing has happened, there's some possibility that there will be some, not necessarily easy reconciliation, but that some exhaustion will enter into the equation where people will simply become exhausted with the emotions, the large emotions around revenge and killing, and will want something much more domestic.
It probably depends very much on us readers, what we read in it, and says more about who we are. How many classicists have contacted you, nagging you about this is not exactly the way it should be, or Mr. tóibín, may I?
I think it's tremendous fun being a novelist because you can really annoy. When I wrote my Henry James novel, like there are people who've been working all their lives on James, like really teaching the stuff, and you can just go in. It's almost like a cattle raid. You can go in just with some guns and just take some things you need, change some things. And some people go nuts. They go nuts. And other people, the most unlikely people, turn out to be really nice and say, yeah, well, you didn't follow, it exactly, did you? You didn't know this, did you? And this, it was worse with the Virgin Mary. Although I just need to say that, the Virgin Mary's, the Testament of Mary was put on as a play in Ireland, and we were already, in case people wanted to walk out or shout or do something, but nothing happened. It was just quiet, and it's a great example of the way Ireland has changed. But one night a priest came, and he wasn't just a priest. He was a professor of moral theology, and he wasn't just that. He was an eminent figure. And Ireland is small. We all sort of, people have met one another once in some peculiar way or other, and the ambassador will agree with nodding her head here. And I said to him, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "I'm just..." But on the way out, he smiled at me and said, "It looked wonderful. I'm getting older. My hearing is not as good as it used to be. So I didn't really hear it all." And it was his way of saying to me, if you think we're making a big fuss over your play, so Bishop attacks play, not our hope, we're not helping you, get your own audiences. And but with this, the person I was living in fear of is a woman called Mary Beard.
Aha,
and
she's fighting with everyone.
And she's a formidable figure, and she's well able to defend herself. And I read a review she wrote of a book about ancient Rome by someone who'd just gone in like me, made a raid on ancient Rome, and oh Lord. And then I was somewhere, and it was midnight, and I was just thought of, that terrible moment where you think, will I go to bed or will I read an email? And you should always go to bed. And there was an email saying, check this. And Mary Beard was fine. Oddly enough, Mary Beard came on side. And I think the reason being that, that she knows that these stories, we cannot tell. And her own work is so much about what's not known, what we cannot judge, how little evidence we have. And therefore, it's not as though there is a novel you could write that would be faithful to what ancient Greece was actually like. I think that's been the core of her work as a scholar. And therefore she didn't seem to mind, you know. And so that was one of the reviews I did read, and I read it several times. And you know, so yeah, I'm not afraid of Mary Beard anymore.
Lucky you. House of Names. There's no "the" in the English title. On purpose?
Oh, because it's not a single house, you know. I think that any house that's old is a house of names, where you just think who lived in what room, what noises came, what smells from cooking. And so when the old woman talks about it, it's one thing. She says this was a house of names. And again, that comes from an Irish play, Riders to the Sea, by John Millington Synge, where the mother, because her sons have been drowned one by one, starts to just recite their names. And that comes up then later on when Clytemnestra starts, she cannot remember the names. And so that whole idea of who was there and who's there now, and all that idea of names being ghosts, effectively.
Like Electra says, also the House of Shadows. Yeah. It's all...
Yeah. Well, yeah, Electra calls it a House of Shadows. Yeah.
And the old lady, or the old woman you refer to, is telling the boys, Erastes and his two friends staying at her house at that time, stories. It's almost like in a Russian doll. She tells the stories that they're in, partly as if in the older versions, without the specifics, but the backbone actually of
it is as
these
though
stories.
The story of Helen of Troy, which has just occurred, has already arrived to her as fragment, and it's arrived on the air. You know, that's the way story comes. And I love the idea of the Irish story, Children of Lyre. I mean, it's the most beautiful story of the cruel stepmother who wants to kill the children, but she doesn't in the end. She turns them into swans with a golden chain between them, the three. And for 900 years, they must fly around and then come back. Of course, when they come back, and they lose their wings and they're just old and they die. But I love the idea of that making its way out of Ireland. And making its way into the Mediterranean, into this place, and you know, into this house of names, their names coming into that too, as a sort of fragmented story. It's
all about kinship. You mentioned Hamlet already. It's as if you find kindred spirits, kindred stories to is that to be sure as a writer, this can happen, this is believable, possible, I can use this is a strand I can write myself my own story in? Or is it just a family you create around yourself?
Well, it's partly that I had previously written a novel that I've been working on for a very long time called Nora Webster, which really is the story of what happened in our house. And down to the smallest detail sometimes. And when it was done, I thought I was done. I thought, well, I've told the story. I don't have another. It's not as though I can go over those years again. And I put so much into the book. And
was that the book you had to write, you think, all your life? You were working towards that book?
Building up to it and coming down from it. And so the idea of being able to find a myth and sort of domesticate the myth a bit, but still make it a place that wasn't Ireland, that no one makes a cup of tea in, for example. No tea making. You know, no rain. You know,
True.
You know, there were so many things that I just thought, if one more shower of rain comes, or one more aunt that nearly bought her coat, you know, and like that, you know, small house, edge of a town, southeast of Ireland, must stop. And so this just gave me a way to keep the show on the road without having to, you know, feel that I was parroting what I had written, that I had put so much care into. You know?
So new wings on your back, and this is a new takeoff, as it were. You consider it a bit outside your work so far? Is it really a departure from what you did so far?
No, it's the same story. Oddly enough, you still have the.
After all,
you still have the family. You know, you still have the emotions between them. You still have the dead father. You still have the mother. You still have the children. You still have people in some sort of strange non-recovery from things that have happened to them. A lot of silences, things not told. So you can't get away from the central business. And also being away, I mean, Erastes' business of being away and coming home. And that's something that I noticed first when I went to live in Spain, that as long as you were safe when you came home and they saw you, they would start telling you things about neighbours. And you said, well, at what point are you going to ask me? Where are you living, or what's Spain like? Or, you know, and they would just never ask. And I gave that to the character in Brooklyn in the book. Her mother just doesn't want to know anything. She was telling her all about Mrs. So-and-so wrote to me and her sister. And then I found that this was in Robert Graves' book about the First World War, that you came home from the trenches for a week. And you thought, surely they're going to ask me about the trenches. And they just say, oh, no, the neighbour next door is asking for you. And she had made a cake. And say, I need to talk about the trenches. And say, actually, they don't want to hear. And that's a phenomenon. And I thought it was a fascinating one. So when Erastes comes home from being kidnapped, they never once say to him, what was it like? Where were you? So, and I just remember one day writing that and thinking, here I am again. You know, it won't stop.
No wings after all.
We all only have one story. And you can try and write novel after novel, and the same things come back in. A woman in Australia once, she seemed a very nice person. She was getting a book signed for somebody, looked at me very seriously and said, so how many die in this one? And I felt, I didn't know what to say to her, because there were quite a number.
It's interesting that you should mention the character, or you, or anyone coming back home from being away and wanting to tell or talk about what it was like and not being asked. Because at the same time, a recurrent theme in your books, or something underlying many of the stories, is the impossibility of talking about what is really utmost on your mind. The silences, the not talking, the talking between the lines. And if there is talk, trying to be very, very precise and finding it hard to find words that actually mean what you have in mind. So,
yeah. So I mean, I think that's,
seems opposite.
I think that's there when Clytemnestra comes back, where she's so traumatized by what she's seen, and then she cannot talk about it. And it's that silence becomes as poisonous as the actual act itself was. And I think that's something that I know about. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You've written about the American poet Elizabeth Bishop, and it's something that you recognized in her work as well, the fact that there's much that's not talked about. Tell us a little bit about her, and what the kinship is.
Well, you know, she was brought up in Nova Scotia, which is really like Ireland. They just talk like us and go on like us generally. And she had a really particularly difficult childhood. Her father died when she was 6 months old, and then her mother was committed to a mental hospital when she was about 5. So she had a vague memory of her mother. She was an only child. And so she was brought up and then sent to different relatives and brought up by various aunts. And but she really flourished in a time in English poetry, or in English language poetry, called, you know, confessional poetry, when Sylvia Plath was writing all about how she felt, and Sexton, Robert Lowell. I mean, everybody was telling everybody everything about themselves. And Bishop just moved more and more into describing something that she saw outside herself. Became more deliberate, more exact, and more precise in trying to control the world by describing the difference between one sort of grey and another, you know, one type of sound and another. But it was always outwards, looking outwards, looking outwards. and that she was very deliberately withheld from the work. The sort of pain, I think, that gave rise to the work, which I think you can find in the rhythms, in the spaces between the lines. You can find some strange levels of emotion and pain. The more she withheld, the more she offered in a certain way. It's a fascinating thing to look at in her work, and that's what interested me in her work, and that's what I tried to unravel to some extent in the book I wrote about her.
Yes, because poems and poetry were for truthfulness, is what she said, and in letters she could be freer. Is that how you feel? Would you say, let me make sure I phrase this correctly, so you cannot get away or around of it. Would you say you're writing, you're writing around the silence or through the silence?
You know, it's not a form of therapy.
No, I'm not suggesting that.
And you can go to a shrink. Even we have some in Ireland now. I mean, someone said to me, you know, that idea of you pay someone not to talk while you talk. God, that must be marvelous, you know. But but you really end up using it. You know, you end up exploiting it for the book. In other words, time and time again, you come to it and you think, I know what I can use here now. As though someone has given me a pot of red paint or a pot of white paint. I'm going to use the paint. And so it is a form of manipulation, rather than, say, a form of self-expression. Mm-hmm. Or on the other hand, it's not a form of self-curing or self-healing. It just doesn't do that.
No, it needs artistry to be able to use the red and the white paint in a controlled way, I imagine. Yeah, because otherwise it would be just blurting it out.
Yeah, that's correct, yeah. And I think Elizabeth Bishop felt that some of the poets were blurting things out, and she was more and more holding things in and then attempting to control the world in case it might disappear again by describing it with such care and such exactitude.
You mentioned in an interview on BBC Radio that your mother once wrote very kindly about your work. She referred to, I think it was, help me, I forgot now, but it was someone whose work she considered smarter than yours. Soul Bellow, exactly. She was telling you to do what exactly? She wanted you to be more...
you know, I think that people have to be very careful. You know, she said she would write me letters about the novels, but one day she said, oh, I've been reading Soul Bellow. She loved Soul Bellow, and she loved just all the sexy stuff in those books. She said, he's so smart. Those books are so snappy. They move along so quickly. And she sort of looked at me, meaning, there isn't any chance, is there, that you're sort of, you know, this sort of melancholy business of yours could actually, for once, just, you know, you could leave us, you know, yeah. So it was a way of letting me know that, she said, you know, that maybe I should urbanize a bit, modernize, globalize, all those things, you know, that, like I say, well, if you want Martin Amos as a son, I'll get him for you. I'll bring him over. You know, you can have him.
Anyway, there's a lot of snappy, sexy, and wild stuff in this book. That's for sure. I
suppose, yeah. But it's novel. But it's not set in contemporary Chicago, you know.
No, well, would that be invisible? Is that possible? A contemporary Chicago novel by colm tóibín?
There won't be one, no.
Ladies and gentlemen.
The world would be spared that.
I would like to offer you the opportunity to ask your questions to Mr. tóibín before we ask him to read some more. So I know this is awkward, always to be the first to raise a hand and ask that. Really great. Here's a microphone coming your way. Please tell us your name and...
Yeah, hi, good evening. My name is Mauricio. I found very interesting when you said that when you started writing this novel, you found the moment when you wanted to go back to your room and continue writing. You wanted to work with the sentences. And one thing I noticed when you read is that there was only one adverb. I noticed only one adverb compared to, for example, the master, where there are more. Let's say there are more. So I was thinking, did you do this on purpose? Because this is a text that relates to ancient times. Did you do it on purpose to work specifically with the language? I guess you did this the same with the master and all the books. But
I think with the novel The Master, which is about Henry James, I was trying to imagine a prose style, which was before Hemingway. You know, before Hemingway just cut back so much. And I was trying to see if I could find a way just to write longer sentences with more words in them, because I felt that I was, once more, that idea worrying about self-parody, that I had written a novel previously called The Blackwater Lightship, where there are no adjectives, no adverbs, 6 characters over 6 days, a lot of rain and making tea. And I just felt, you know, I just need to try and expand a bit and get a bit more florid. With this, I wouldn't have been alert as much to the adverb thing, but as much that I'm writing declarative sentences, so that she's not just trying to describe the world for you, so you can see it, as much as she's speaking aloud, almost like a bell, or in public, and therefore she's just not going to help you sometimes with adverbs or adjectives, as much as she's going to come at you with her voice. And so that happened of its own accord. In other words, the rhythms of that were dictated by something I had imagined, rather than by something I had, say, worked out slowly beforehand as to how will I write this. Because I think if you put too much thought into how you work, technical thought or linguistic stuff, that you end up working to a formula of your own making, rather than letting the thing happen of its own accord and see where it will take you. And but I'm delighted to hear about that one adjective. And if I'd found it, I probably would have taken it out.
Is it easier, by the way, to come into that tone of voice writing from an I?
Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely, yeah. But also, because I had written The Testament of Mary, and it was performed by a good number of actresses, and I'd been around rehearsal. I'd been sort of watching that way where a voice develops or builds up, and it was still with me, really, when I came to work with that.
Thank you. More questions? Here, over here.
Hi, I'm Cecilia. When I was a teenager, I once wrote a short story that surprisingly won a high school competition and was published. And so my philosophy teacher got to read it and asked me what I found a rather stupid question. Sorry, I'm nervous. You're one of my 2 favorite writers. He asked me this, which I thought was a rather stupid question, but I could not answer. And it was, why did you choose to write using the voice of a man? So do you also think it was a stupid question? And if my philosophy teacher was to ask you the same thing, why do you so often write using the voice of a woman? What would you say? Would you have an answer?
It's difficult. I mean, the next 2 books, I think, are... there's one of them nearly finished, and there's another one starting, that are told from the point of view of a man. The answer I would give in relation to this and in relation to the Testament of Mary is that if somebody is powerless, then voice becomes power. That in other words, in the case of Clytemnestra or Electra, they don't begin with power. Or in the case of, say, Mary, the mother of Jesus, they don't begin with power. What if they spoke? What would it sound like if someone let them speak once? And I think we have that going right through the Greek theatre, from Medea, from Electra to Antigone, where Creon in Antigone, when he speaks, it has no texture. Actors can do it, but actresses coming on with, and even before she speaks, the audience can't take their eyes off her because her voice will be filled with texture, flavor. She will have things to say because she may not get to speak again. So that out of that powerlessness, you get texture. So that people who have a lot of power don't tend to have that much texture in their speech. And so, I mean, I think a lot of people have worked with that. And it was there. So that the two women in this book are given first-person voices. But poor old Erastes is just, because he couldn't speak. He wouldn't know what to say. Whereas they do, because there's an urgency. They may not get to speak again. And so that's one of the ways, one of the things I was working with was out of that whole idea, which I think you really, really get in opera. And if you think about the way in which the figure of Maria Callas, seeing those Verdi roles, for example, or even with the Bach cantatas, often it's the contralto or the soprano voice that you really relish and remember as coming out of a visceral urge for utterance. Whereas the recitative stuff is often just a tenor filling in the gaps. And maybe that's what men are just for. We're just there to fill in the gaps. But I mean, it's a hard question to answer. I just want to say one more thing about it. That I mean, Nadine Gordimer has a wonderful novel called The Conservationist, told from a man's point of view, and it's fascinating to watch just how, if you read it blindfold, as it were, you wouldn't have a clue of the gender of the author. So that it's something maybe we should all know how to do by just watching each other, But it's a rich issue because. And there are many other things to be said about it, and some of them I don't even know what they are.
More questions? Yes? Or you can speak up. It's coming your way.
Hi, my name's Andrew. It's a slightly odd question. You probably look at it and say I can't answer it anyway, and then you can move on to somebody else. You're one of the writers for me that's sort of accompanied me when I've been, growing up. I think everyone's got 3 or 4 writers who go through their lives, and you follow everything that they do. And when you were talking about The House of Names, it made me think of one of the most important books in my kind of early adulthood, which was The Heather Blazing, which I still think is an astonishing book if you want to understand Ireland. But when you were talking about The House of Names, I suddenly thought he's talking about the Heather Blazing, actually, because that's this mythical family situation. And then I started to think, all your books are about mythical family situations. So the question is, why do the Irish write about family all the time? And is it because family represents something bigger, or is it because there isn't anything bigger than the family?
Yeah, John McGahern, who was a friend of mine and wrote wonderful novels, said that he had a feeling about the society, that it hadn't really blended into becoming a nation or a society as much as a set of families, and that people's relationship to their family was very, and in a novel called Amongst Women, he explored this very deeply, where the girls in the family are only really, they feel only great when they're with each other, when they're spread out in London or Dublin, they're sort of nobody. But once 2 or 3 of them can discuss small family things, they become somebody. But I suppose that idea of look, I think that if you are in a country that has a very long winter, that people. I think the Icelandic novel has some of the same quality. That if you have a long winter, and if you also have a history of poverty, where it isn't as though people can suddenly become rich or something, that people will tend to think about their parents or have spent a lot more time with their siblings than is entirely necessary or healthy, and aunts arriving. But it's there in Jane Austen. That sort of whole idea of those sisters, but there's always an escape in Jane Austen. It's always as though the novels are being written to show the door that will open into the light, and the Irish novels have a door, and someone has locked it, and that has to say something about the difference between the two societies. And maybe if we could just get the novelists to unlock the door, we could open up Ireland and all, to the capitalism, globalization, and world happiness or something.
There was a lady here wanting to ask a question as well. It's for the people at the back as well.
My name is Anne, and I'm Irish, and I wanted to ask about the family as well, but something slightly different, because just in the past week, an actor I absolutely adore died, Harry Dean Stanton, and I was thinking about Paris, Texas, and I was thinking one of the most beautiful films to me ever made, and it's just unhappiness and a unhappy family. And just listening to you, I was just wondering, would classic, contemporary and future literature collapse if families weren't so miserable?
You see, I take a different line on Paris, Texas, where it's made by a European, and what it does is it gives a place in America, a sort of haunting, that Americans in general don't allow their places to have. The whole myth of America is you move on. If somewhere doesn't please you, you go to the next place, and you don't care about where you've just been. The past doesn't interest people as much as, say, the European past interests us. What was fascinating about that film was the way in which this place, this single place, and so that possibility is open now. I think that film opened a possibility in American writing, which I haven't noticed anyone following very much. But nonetheless, it's not as though we're ever all going to be cured. And once we know that, cured of unhappiness or cured of just problems that arise. It's not as though we're ever all going to be sunny Californians waving at everybody. And even they must have their moments of funny dreams or something, or worries, but that once all those things are there, the novels are going to be there too. The stories need to be told, just in the same way as dreams. We need our dreams, so it's not going to go away.
tóibín, may I ask you to read one last excerpt from House of Names?
I was talking about the Hamlet thing, and I realized that I had a real problem with the book, that what do you do with the character after he's murdered his mother? Can he have dinner, or can he, he lay awake? Yeah, I'm sure he did, no matter what you do, it's a sort of cliche. And so what I did was, you just turn the page and it's his mother. She's actually still around. She's a ghost. She won't go away, and she's looking for something. So this is just the last section of that moment where Clytemnestra is, and she doesn't remember how she was killed. She's not looking for revenge. She's looking for something else. She doesn't know what it is. I walked in the corridors of that palace, where I had once lived, I could almost remember some things that had happened. There was an image of someone in a garden or of steps that led to a garden, staring hard, breathing hard, but then nothing, just stillness in the garden. Then there was not even a garden, there was merely a space. But I was still awake, I was waiting, knowing that there would be change, that it would not always be like this. I was aware how easy it would be, once I was in those corridors again, for one of the guards to notice me, if I made a sound or if I moved quickly, so that there would be some disturbance in the air. And then slowly I began to understand why I was here and who I was looking for. His name did not come to me. I was not able to picture his face, but I felt that he was close. I could imagine the guard who had seen me, or who had noticed my presence, consulting one of the other guards, and both of them approaching him, the one I'm searching for, or his friend who looks after him. My husband is dead, and my daughter, they have become pure shade. My other daughter is here, but the one I'm searching for is my son. I'm awake. The words I knew are sleeping. Sometimes they turn in the night or make some sound in their vast dreaming, and then they wake too. Often, if only for a second, they open their eyes and watch me. I hold their gaze so that they might remember me as they fall back into sleep. I study them then in their inert state. I'm alert to any movement they make. I can hear their dark groanings in the night, intermittent against their breathing. I can see them reach their arms towards me to be lifted. I can tell the difference between night and day now. I know the silence that descends on the gardens and corridors at night, a silence broken only by the soft movements of the guards or of cats. This is my realm, where I'm free to wander. As I came from the garden, I'm aware the guards can feel a movement in the air. It would just take one more thing to let them know that I'm with them. A sound, a darting gesture. When the time came, I knew that I would hear his name, my son's name, enough to whisper it like someone imploring. It would come to me when I needed it. Erastes, I whispered on one of those nights, and then I withdrew into the shadows. Erastes, I repeated, letting my voice echo down the corridor. I saw two of the guards running back and forth, and then summoning the other one, my son's friend, who strutted up and down, checking doorways and corners. I waited until he had gone, and then I whispered to one of the guards, "Tell Erastes that I'm his mother. He must come alone into the corridor. He must be alone." The guard made as though to run, but he stopped himself. "Speak again," he said quietly, his head bowed. "Tell Erastes to come alone," I said. "Now?" he asked. "Soon. Erastes must come soon." "Do you mean to cause him harm?" "No, I do not mean to cause him harm." Thank you.